At 4 o'clock in the morning, the most dangerous woman on that Virginia plantation was already awake. She was not carrying a rifle. She was not planning an escape. She was standing over a fire, with a wooden spoon in her hand. By sunrise, the master would eat the breakfast she prepared. By noon, he would be too sick to leave his bed. And by nightfall, 3 men in the quarters would know the patrol route had changed, because she had made sure the right conversation reached the right ears. That is the part of slavery people are rarely taught. The deadliest resistance was not always loud. It did not always run through the woods with bloodhounds behind it. Sometimes, it stood in a plantation kitchen, stirring cornmeal, skimming grease, listening. Virginia, 1840. Before the sun came up, before the fields filled, before the master rang for coffee, the kitchen was already alive. Smoke clung to the rafters. Animal fat hissed in black iron pans. Ash floated in the air like gray snow. The building stood 50 feet from the big house, far enough to keep fire from spreading, far enough to keep the smell of cooking away from white curtains and polished silver, far enough that the people inside it could be forgotten until their labor was needed. That was how the master liked it. Food without presence, service without humanity, a whole world of black labor made invisible until breakfast appeared on the table. The woman who ruled that kitchen was named Ruth, 48 years old, shoulders bent from years of carrying water, forearms scarred by grease burns and oven iron, eyes sharp enough to read a room before anyone in it had spoken. She had cooked on that plantation for 23 years, long enough to know exactly how much flour the mistress wasted in a month, long enough to know which child in the big house lied badly, long enough to know when the master was frightened, because frightened men ate differently. That morning she was making salt pork, hoe cakes, and stewed apples. Simple food, heavy food, food that sat in a man's stomach and made him slow. To anyone glancing through the doorway, it was just breakfast. Another enslaved woman bent over another fire. Another morning beginning exactly the way the one before it had begun. But that kitchen was not what it appeared to be. It was not only a place where food was cooked. It was an intelligence room, a relay station, a sanctuary, a battlefield with no smoke except from the stove. Ruth knew things no white person on that plantation realized she knew. She knew the master planned to sell 2 boys after harvest. She knew the overseer had gambling debts in Richmond. She knew the patrol would ride South Road on Thursday instead of West Road, because she had heard the master say it over coffee the night before. And every piece of that knowledge mattered, because knowledge moved through a plantation the same way heat moved through iron, quietly, completely, and once it spread, it changed what was possible. A 12-year-old girl named Dinah carried plates from the kitchen to the dining room, small, silent, forgettable in the eyes of the people she served, which made her useful. Ruth never told Dinah everything. No one ever told one person everything. That was how you stayed alive. But she told her enough. A hum while kneading dough meant listen carefully tonight. A spoon set upside down on the back shelf meant the master was planning travel. A folded cloth left near the water bucket meant danger in the quarters before dawn. Nothing written down. Nothing that could be found in a search. Nothing a white man would notice unless he already knew it was there. That was the first rule of the silent battlefield. If resistance is visible, it does not survive long. Ruth took the pot of apples off the flame, set it aside, reached for a small pouch hanging behind a beam. Not poison, not enough to kill, nothing dramatic. Nothing that would bring a doctor running and a whipping line to the kitchen yard. Just dried foxglove, ground fine, A pinch so small it vanished into the steam. Enough to make a man weak. Enough to put him in bed. Enough to slow his temper and shorten his reach. She stirred once, twice, pouch, and hung it back in its place. Her face did not change, not a flicker, not a hesitation. That was the second rule. If your hand shakes, someone you love may pay for it. Outside, dawn was beginning to silver the yard. Soon the bell would ring. Soon the men and women in the fields would begin another day of measured exhaustion. Soon the master would sit at his table, unfold his newspaper, and eat food prepared by the woman he believed he owned completely. He did not own her completely. That was the lie the whole plantation depended on. Because while he ate, Ruth would listen. Dinah would carry. A boy at the well would repeat one sentence to a man in the stables. That man would pass it to his wife after dark. And by morning, 3 people who needed to know would know. The plantation kitchen had been built to feed the master's house. In Ruth's hands, it had become something else. A place where memory survived. A place where information moved. A place where the system paid, every day, in ways it could feel but rarely prove. By the time the breakfast tray left the kitchen, the war had already begun. The master tasted the apples first. That was always his habit. Sweet things before salt. Ruth knew it. She had known it for years. She stood near the hearth, while the tray was carried away, hands folded in front of her apron, face calm, eyes lowered just enough to look respectful. Inside her chest, her heart was beating like a hammer, not because she doubted what she had done, but because she understood the cost of being wrong. That was the third rule of the silent battlefield. If you strike, you must never strike hard enough to be seen. The foxglove and the apples would not kill him. Not today. Not tomorrow. It would only make him weak. A headache that refused to leave. A heaviness in the limbs. A tiredness that no sleep seemed to fix. Enough to keep him inside. Enough to make him cancel the ride he had planned through the fields. Enough to slow the overseer's fury when the cotton rows did not look perfect. That was the goal, not death. Delay. Sabotage on a plantation rarely looked dramatic. There were no explosions, no secret meetings under moonlight with whispered vows. Instead, there were 1,000 tiny fractures. A wagon wheel that cracked 2 days earlier than it should have. A plow blade that snapped because someone sharpened it just a little too thin. Seeds that never sprouted because someone had boiled them quietly the night before planting. Each act was small. Each act was deniable. Each act could be blamed on weather, carelessness, bad luck. But add them together, and the plantation began to bleed. In Georgia, an overseer once wrote that productivity on his plantation had fallen by nearly 1/3 in 6 months. He blamed laziness. He blamed disobedience. He blamed what he called the natural weakness of the people he enslaved. He never considered the truth, that the system itself was being slowly dismantled from the inside. Back in the kitchen, Ruth was already preparing the next meal. Cornbread dough in a wooden bowl. Salt pork sizzling over the fire. The routine never stopped. The plantation demanded food the way a furnace demanded coal. Morning, midday, night. And every meal brought another opportunity. Not always sabotage. Sometimes something even more dangerous. Information. Around noon, a boy from the well came through the kitchen door, carrying 2 buckets of water. His name was Elijah. 14 years old. Long legs. Quick eyes. Ruth never spoke directly when the door was open. She never asked questions in a way that could be repeated. Instead, she said something ordinary. Something that sounded like kitchen talk. "Master's not riding today," she said quietly while stirring the pot. "Doctor told him to rest." Elijah nodded, like a boy listening to instructions about boiling water. But when he carried the empty buckets back across the yard, he repeated that sentence to a man repairing harness straps in the stable. "Master's not riding today." The man in the stable repeated it later that evening in the quarters. "Master's staying in the house." That meant something important. The overseer would be watching less closely. Patrol routes might shift. Work pace might loosen just enough to breathe. That was the 4th rule. Information is oxygen. On a plantation, knowledge could change everything. If people knew a sale was coming, families prepared. If people knew the overseer had debts, they understood his anger came from fear. If people knew patrols were moving a different road, someone planning escape might live another day. And almost all of that information passed through the same place, the kitchen, because the cook heard everything. She heard arguments between the master and his wife. She heard business conversations over dinner. She heard the careless way white men spoke when they believed no one important was listening. But the kitchen held another kind of resistance too, one that had nothing to do with poison or sabotage. Memory. Noon. While the fire burned low and the kitchen rested between meals, Ruth prepared a pot of black-eyed peas. Not for the master's table, for the quarters. The recipe was older than Virginia, older than the plantation, older even than the country that claimed to own her. West Africa. She had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from her grandmother. Black-eyed peas, rice, bits of smoked pork when they could spare it, hot pepper when they had it, food that carried memory inside it, food that reminded people they had not always belonged to someone else. When the pot was finished, Ruth tasted it once, closed her eyes, just for a moment, because that was the other war happening in that kitchen. The war to keep culture alive, to keep language alive, to keep identity alive in a place designed to grind it away. The master believed he owned everything on that plantation. The land, the labor, the bodies. But there were things he could never control. The quiet conversations that moved through smoke and steam. The knowledge passed between hands carrying plates. The recipes whispered from mother to child. The small acts that slowed the machine just enough to remind everyone inside it that it was not unstoppable. And by the time the dinner bell rang that evening, the silent battlefield inside the kitchen was already preparing its next move. By the time evening came, the kitchen was hotter than the fields. The fire had been burning since before dawn. Iron pots hissed. Grease popped against the stone. The air inside that room felt thick enough to drink. But Ruth barely noticed the heat anymore. After 20 years, your body stopped arguing with the fire. What she noticed instead were the sounds. The creak of the back door, footsteps in the yard, voices drifting from the big house when the windows were open. Those sounds mattered, because the kitchen was the one place on the plantation where the walls listened more than they spoke. Dinner was being prepared for the master and his guests that night. Salt pork, boiled greens, cornbread, and a stew that had been simmering since afternoon. Guests meant longer meals, more conversation, more careless words spoken over full plates. That was when the kitchen did its best work. Dinah stood beside the long table, drying dishes with a cloth. She was 12, small enough to pass through rooms unnoticed, old enough to understand what mattered. "Keep your ears open tonight," Ruth said quietly without looking at her. It sounded like ordinary instruction, but Dinah knew what it meant. When the food was ready, she carried the first tray into the big house. The dining room smelled of candles and tobacco. The master sat at the head of the table, 2 white men beside him. A bottle of whiskey already open. Dinah moved slowly around the table, placing plates, pouring water, eyes lowered the way she had been taught. Invisible. That was the role. But invisible people hear everything. The master was already complaining. About prices, about cotton, about how difficult it had become to control labor. Then one of the guests asked a question. "How many you got working this place now?" 43, the master said, "though I may sell off a few come winter." Dinah kept her face blank, but the words landed heavy. Sell off a few. On a plantation, those words could break families. Send husbands south. Send children away forever. The men kept talking. They spoke about debts, about new land, about a patrol scheduled for Thursday night. Dinah memorized every sentence, not writing it down, not repeating it under her breath, just storing it carefully. When she returned to the kitchen, Ruth didn't ask questions. Not immediately. She waited until the door was closed, until the fire cracked loudly enough to swallow quiet voices. Then she spoke. What did they say? Dinah repeated it exactly, word for word. 43 workers. Possible sale in winter. Patrol Thursday night. Ruth nodded slowly, not surprised, just thinking. Information like that didn't stay in one place. It moved, carefully, through trusted hands. Later that night, Ruth would mention something to her husband while collecting water. Nothing obvious, just a sentence placed casually in conversation. Sounds like patrol riding Thursday. Her husband would carry that sentence to the quarters. Someone else would carry it to the fields. Someone else to the stables. By morning, everyone who needed to know would know. That was the real power of the kitchen. Not the fire, not the food, the network. A plantation looked like a machine from the outside. Orders moving down, labor moving up, control flowing from the big house. But beneath that structure, another system existed. Quiet, hidden, alive. Information traveled through buckets of water, through baskets of vegetables, through songs hummed while kneading dough. No written messages, no secret meetings, nothing that could be easily discovered. Just human memory, human trust, and the understanding that survival depended on both. Frederick Douglass would later describe enslaved people as the greatest actors in America. They had to be. The mask was part of survival. A cook laughing at the master's joke, a field hand thanking the overseer for kindness, a house servant nodding politely while memorizing every conversation in the room. 2 realities lived inside the same person. The face the master saw, and the mind the master never understood. Ruth carried both every day. She stirred soup. She served plates. She answered every command with "Yes, sir." But beneath that performance, the silent battlefield never rested. Because every meal that left that kitchen carried more than food. It carried information. It carried memory. And sometimes, it carried the quietest form of resistance the plantation would ever know. By midnight, the plantation was quiet, at least from the outside. The big house was dark except for one window. The overseer had gone to his cabin. The fields were empty, the road beyond the trees silent. But the plantation was never truly asleep. In the quarters, people spoke in low voices. A man mending a harness mentioned something he had heard. A woman braiding her daughter's hair repeated a rumor. A boy pretending to sleep listened to everything. That was how the network worked.
No speeches. No meetings. No declarations of rebellion. Just information passing from one careful mouth to another. By morning, nearly everyone on the plantation would know something had changed. The master might sell people in winter. The patrol would ride Thursday night. The master himself was too weak to leave the house today. Those details were small, but on a plantation, small details could mean survival. A man thinking about escape would wait 2 more days. A family fearing separation would begin hiding food. Someone planning resistance would know when the overseer's eyes might be elsewhere. Knowledge didn't break chains, but it made the chains easier to slip. Back in the kitchen, Ruth was still awake. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, the air smelled of ash and boiled greens. She sat on a low stool near the hearth, her hands resting in her lap. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to be still. The hardest part of resistance wasn't the act itself, it was the performance afterward. All day she had smiled. All day she had answered politely. All day she had stood inches away from the man whose breakfast she had quietly weakened. One wrong look, one flicker of satisfaction, one moment where her mask slipped, and everything could be lost. The punishment wouldn't stop with her. That was the true terror of plantation life. A master who suspected sabotage rarely punished just one person. The entire kitchen could be whipped. Children could be sold. Families broken apart in a single afternoon. Every act of resistance carried that weight. Every decision balanced anger against survival. Ruth had dreamed about that many nights, dreams where the master suddenly understood. Dreams where the overseer dragged her into the yard and demanded answers. Dreams where her husband disappeared down the road in chains. Fear lived beside courage every single day. But in the morning she would wake again. She would step into the kitchen, she would stand in front of the fire. And she would choose again. Not always sabotage, not always risk. Sometimes survival meant doing nothing. But sometimes, doing nothing meant losing something deeper. Dignity, memory, self. That was why resistance on a plantation rarely looked dramatic. It couldn't afford to. Instead it appeared as accidents. Burned bread. Spoiled meat. Broken tools. Slow work. The plantation system depended on control. On efficiency. On perfect obedience. 1,000 small disruptions could weaken that system more effectively than one loud revolt. A master might survive a rebellion. But constant sabotage, constant uncertainty, constant inefficiency, that slowly drained his power. And the most dangerous part was this. He often never knew it was happening. He blamed bad weather, lazy workers, broken equipment. He rarely imagined that the people he believed he controlled completely were quietly reshaping the world around him. Back in the kitchen, Ruth added one last piece of wood to the fire. The flame rose softly. Light flickered across the walls. Tomorrow morning she would wake before dawn again. The master would ring for coffee. Dinah would carry plates to the dining room. Elijah would bring water from the well. The same routine, the same roles, the same masks. But beneath the surface, the silent battlefield would still be there. Waiting, watching, preparing its next move.
History remembers the loud rebellions. The ones with gunfire. The ones with headlines. The ones where the system was challenged openly and violently. Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, the Underground Railroad. Those stories deserve to be remembered. They changed the course of history. But they were not the only battlefield. Most resistance did not happen in the forest. It happened in places like Ruth's kitchen. Small rooms filled with smoke. Wood fires burning before dawn. Iron pots blackened by years of work. Places where the war looked ordinary. Because the truth is this. The plantation system was not weakened only by revolts. It was weakened by thousands of quiet decisions made every single day. A cook adding the wrong herb to the master's meal. A field hand dulling the blade of a plow. A wagon wheel cracking at the worst possible moment. Seeds that never grew. Tools that disappeared. None of these acts would appear in a history book. None of them would be recorded by the master. But together, they slowed the machine. And sometimes slowing the machine was enough to save a life. But resistance in that kitchen was not only about sabotage. It was also about survival. And something even more powerful. Memory. When Ruth cooked black-eyed peas and rice for the quarters, she was doing more than preparing a meal. She was protecting a memory older than the plantation. Older than Virginia. Older than America. West Africa. Every recipe carried something forward. A flavor. A method. A story. Food became language when language was forbidden. Food became culture when culture was under attack. That is how tradition survived. That is how identity survived. And over generations, those same dishes would become something new. Soul food. Creole cooking. Southern cuisine. Food born in oppression, transformed into heritage. The songs hummed in kitchens would become spirituals. The rhythms would become blues. Then jazz. Then gospel. Entire traditions of American culture began in rooms where enslaved people were never supposed to leave a legacy. That is the irony of the plantation system. It tried to erase a people, and instead, it created one of the strongest cultural foundations in American history. The master believed he owned everything on that plantation. The land, the labor, the bodies. But there were things he could never own. The knowledge passed between workers. The quiet courage required to resist in silence. The culture carried through food and song. And the human will to remain human. Even in a system designed to destroy that humanity. Ruth would never see freedom. Not in her lifetime. But every act she committed in that kitchen mattered. Every piece of information passed quietly through the yard mattered. Every recipe taught to the next generation mattered. Because resistance does not always look like revolution. Sometimes, it looks like survival. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing over a fire before sunrise, holding a wooden spoon, and refusing to let the system take everything from her. The plantation kitchen was meant to feed the master, but in the hands of people like Ruth, it became something far more powerful. A place where culture survived, where information moved, where resistance lived quietly, in plain sight. That was the silent battlefield. And the war fought there was real. It was fought with patience, with intelligence, with courage that history rarely records. And it reminds us of something important. Even in the harshest systems ever created, people still found ways to resist. People still found ways to remain themselves. People still found ways to survive. That is the legacy of the silent battlefield. Not just defiance, not just sabotage, but the unbreakable decision to remain human.